Hello everyone, I'm David Vaucher. Welcome to Business of Motorsport powered by VaucherAnalytics. Now the purpose of VaucherAnalytics is to help automotive brands leverage racing as a truly strategic tool. And I've been talking about this a lot in the context of competition from Chinese EV vehicles. And this can be seen on both sides. It can be used by legacy automotive brands as a way of building a defensive moat against Chinese EVs. And something I've been following increasingly is the use of motorsport by Chinese EV companies to build up their historical brand equity going into the future. So obviously, they may not have much now, but they will do most certainly in the future because they will be doing exactly what legacy brands have been doing for the past decades, and that's go racing. Now, there have been some isolated reports here and there of Chinese brands looking to enter the automotive motorsport space, and today I had to get an episode out because we've heard what I think is the most significant story in that vein, which is BYD potentially exploring an entry into Formula One and endurance racing. So I want to talk about this. Let's talk about what would happen if BYD entered Formula One. And I don't think it would mean anything less than the last automotive advantage of legacy brands disappearing. So this really is the rumor that should terrify legacy automakers. Reports surfaced on March 10th that BYD is exploring an entry into Formula One as well as endurance racing. And these reports should be treated as a giant flashing warning sign for legacy automotive brands. Many legacy automotive brands today sell cars based on their decades of investment on the racetrack. Going racing created mythology, mythology created brand equity, and brand equity allowed manufacturers to charge prices above what objective specifications alone would justify. Now, if that sounds like the pricing strategy for luxury goods, sell the dream, not the product, that's exactly what it is. In the face of growing competition from aggressively priced Chinese EVs, it is a strategy that legacy automakers will have to adopt even more strongly to stay ahead, and maybe even just to sell cars, full stop. Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers have disrupted many parts of the automotive industry in recent years. They have challenged incumbents on cost, production scale, battery technology, and speed of innovation. Until now, however, they have largely stayed out of the one arena that sustains the emotional dimension of automotive brands, and that's global motorsport. Now, the rise of Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers is not simply a matter of new competitors appearing in a crowded market. It really does represent a structural shift in how cars are designed, manufactured, and brought to the market. Chinese EV leaders operate with advantages that legacy automakers cannot easily replicate. Vertically integrated supply chains, close coordination with domestic battery ecosystems, rapid product iteration cycles, and cost structures optimized for electric platforms from the outset. And of course, we have to say it, along with government support and laws, or you could say lack of laws, which don't look like those in historical automotive production centers. Now, these advantages make direct competition on traditional industrial metrics extremely difficult. Attempting to beat Chinese manufacturers on price or production velocity is unlikely to succeed for established brands. I've just released a white paper called The Quartz Protocol, which illustrates how automotive brands can use motorsport as a defensive moat against these Chinese EVs and really just against each other. I will leave a link to download this in the show notes. And in the Quartz Protocol, the global automotive industry is illustrated as experiencing a dynamic similar to the disruption that quartz technology brought to Swiss watchmaking in the 1970s. So if you have a watch and the second hand ticks, it runs on quartz technology. But this wasn't always the standard. When Japanese manufacturers introduced highly accurate battery-powered watches at dramatically lower prices, the Swiss could not win the competition on objective performance because before then, all watches were mechanical and they were marketed on objective metrics such as precision. Their survival after the introduction of cheaper technology which commoditized those objective specs depended on redefining what watches represented, not tools, but objects of desire. And automakers today face an analogous choice. They can either attempt to compete with Chinese EV manufacturers on commodity metrics such as price, software features, and hardware specifications, or they can pivot toward emotional differentiation and brand mythology. Now, motorsport has historically been the engine of that mythology, serving to build the industry's emotional infrastructure. Indeed, victory at Le Mans reinforced Porsche's identity as a benchmark for engineering excellence. Dominance in Formula One helped cement the performance credibility of Mercedes-Benz AMG. And rally success turned Subaru and Mitsubishi into cultural icons among enthusiasts. And these stories are only a tiny handful among so many. And they were not merely marketing exercises. They became foundational elements of brand equity, enabling manufacturers to sell road cars at premium prices while maintaining customer loyalty and cultural relevance, even decades after these feats were achieved. Motorsport created what might be called the soul of automotive brands. Now, Chinese manufacturers lack the historical presence required to participate in that mythology, but that will not be the case for long. Today, their products compete on price and features, and perhaps for a time still, they will be perceived as appliances, tools for transportation, rather than aspirational objects. That perception gap could function as an invisible shield for legacy automakers, but a serious Chinese entry into Formula One would begin to erode that shield, and it's hard to think of a more serious and more credible entry into Formula One than BYD. So here's why a hypothetical BYD Formula One entry would matter far beyond racing. If BYD were to enter Formula One, the implications would extend well beyond the addition of another team to the grid. It would signal that Chinese EV manufacturers are beginning to address the final weakness in their global brand strategies, and that's emotional legitimacy. In Western markets, consumers still associate motorsport with engineering excellence, performance credibility, and technological leadership, and participation in Formula One carries symbolic weight that extends far beyond lap times, and that's especially true in the Drive to Survive era. This is a very expensive gamble, certainly, but the calculus is obvious. For a company like BYD, which already commands enormous manufacturing scale and technical capability, a racing program would serve as a cultural accelerator. It would allow the company to reposition itself not merely as a producer of efficient electrical vehicles, but as a technologically sophisticated performance brand capable of competing on the most prestigious stage in automotive engineering against some of the biggest brands in the world. And that narrative will be even more pronounced if they participate in endurance racing, which features an even greater number of manufacturers. In other words, motorsport could transform Chinese EV companies from efficient challengers into aspirational competitors. The moment Chinese brands begin building racing mythology, the industry's historical hierarchy begins to collapse. At that point, legacy automakers can no longer rely on heritage alone to justify premium positioning, and they will compete directly with companies that may already hold structural advantages in cost, production speed, and supply chain integration. Racing will no longer be a nice to have activity when times are good. It will literally become existential in the long run. There's no time to waste either, because with oil prices spiking in March 2026, customers may be starting their EV research now for a purchase down the line. And if a Chinese EV looks good on paper, what will stop them from making that choice? So legacy automakers must have a plan to go racing and make the most of their campaigns. For many legacy automakers, motorsport has long been treated as a marketing expense that can be expanded or reduced depending on economic conditions. And that mindset is increasingly risky. As functional differentiation between vehicles narrows, especially in the EV era, the emotional dimension of automotive brands becomes more important, not less. Motorsport provides one of the few scalable ways to generate that emotional differentiation at a global level. If Chinese manufacturers begin to build their own racing narratives while legacy brands retreat from competition or fail to translate racing success into product strategy, the balance of cultural power in the industry will shift. And once that shift occurs, it will be extremely difficult to reverse. Brand mythology compounds over decades. It cannot be rebuilt overnight. The window for legacy brands is closing, and the strategic implication is straightforward but difficult to face. Motorsport should no longer be viewed as a discretionary activity justified primarily by marketing exposure or engineering experimentation. It must be treated instead as a core element of brand strategy and competitive positioning. Racing programs must be integrated into product development, marketing architecture, dealer activation, and long-term brand storytelling. The companies that treat motorsport as a systemic asset will strengthen their ability to defend pricing power and maintain cultural relevance. Those that treat it as entertainment risk watching competitors, perhaps including Chinese EV manufacturers, capture the narrative terrain that once belonged to them. And I now want to close out with a few words on the next phase of global automotive competition. The global automotive industry is entering a new phase. The first phase of the EV transition revolved around technology, batteries, software, and manufacturing scale. The second phase will revolve around culture. If Chinese EV manufacturers begin competing in global motorsport, they will no longer be fighting solely on the industrial battlefield. They will also be competing for the emotional loyalty of drivers and enthusiasts worldwide. That competition could redefine how the next generation of consumers perceives automotive brands. For legacy automakers, the lesson is clear. The moment Chinese manufacturers begin building their own racing mythology, the industry's final psychological advantage begins to disappear. And if that happens, the last automotive advantage for legacy automotive brands may disappear with it. And that is it for this late breaking episode of the Business of Motorsport. This is certainly a story I am really, really excited to see develop. But in the meantime, I want to thank you so much for choosing to spend your time with me on this episode of Business of Motorsport. And I'm really looking forward to speaking with you on the next episode. Thanks so much.